Happy New Year, Variant Nation. It has been another amazing year. In 2023, Variant had over 27 million people watch our content, which is a hard number to wrap our heads around. But we can't tell you how grateful we are that you all continue to watch and enjoy the show and for letting us be a part of your year. But I can tell you this, we have some amazing stuff cooking for 2024, so hold on to your butt cheeks because Variant is just getting started. In the meantime, all of us here at Variant hope you have a safe and happy kickoff to the new year. To get things started right, we've got a special New Year's Eve show in store for you. Comic Tom, Jeff the Golden Age Guru, and Fire Guy Ryan are back to give you an epic breakdown of the history of the Copper Age of comics. A few years ago, we partnered with Tom and Jeff to begin a series of episodes breaking down every age of comics. So you can check out our videos on the Golden, Silver, and Bronze Age right here. And today we're continuing the series with the Copper Age with the big finale breaking down the ongoing Modern Age slated for later in 2024. As for the Copper Age, the guys freaking crushed this episode, so we're excited to bring it to you guys. Tom is also going to be giving away a first print Amazing Spider-Man 300, which is the first appearance of Venom, so make sure to stick around at the end for details on that. And without further ado, let's get to Tom and the guys for the history of the Copper Age.
It's good to be back, Variant Nation, because we're here to talk about my all-time favorite era of comic books. We already took you through the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age, but this age is suspiciously short.
It's short but sweet. The start and end points of the Copper Age are a little fuzzy, but fair warning. Every single comic book that we are going to mention during this video is recommended. You need to read this stuff. It's all legendary and very easy to find, so get to it.
In the grand scope of comics, this era is tiny. We're talking mid-80s to early 90s. And like you mentioned, some of the most influential stuff that will shape generations, and not just in the comics, but we're going to see that spill over into cartoons and into toys.
We last left off with the two main publishers doing something very unique. Crisis on Infinite Earths, the event at DC, restarted continuity that was getting so confusing. Marvel did their first event, their largest attempt of bringing superheroes and villains in the pages of one story arc. And it wasn't just because it was going to be a good read. No, it was a deal with Mattel to make a lot of action figures.
Money is the name of the game here, and they're going to hit on the fronts of toys, games, cartoons. When we talk about toys, TMNT came out in 1984. This was a lonely 3,200 issue print run, which sold out, and it had multiple reprints in the initial year because of its popularity. In 1988 to 1992, we saw $1.1 billion in sales of their toys, coming off their smash hit animated series in 1987.
It's kind of impossible to overstate how big of an impact the success of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had on this time period, because you had so many imitators coming out of the woodworks, such as adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters.
Of course, let's not forget about karate creatures and everyone's favorite preteen dirty jean kung fu kangaroos.
You could basically do an entire video about the success and the influence of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but the fact that it was two guys printing a few thousand copies of a black and white independent comic book out of their garage, blowing up into one of the world's biggest multimedia franchises. By the way, the new movie was really good, Mutant Mayhem. I love that. Thank you, Kevin Eastman, for creating TMNT, but we gotta look at some other things that happened in the early part of the Copper Age of comics, because there were several other creators who we'll be talking about throughout the course of this video who got their start very early on in this same year, 1984.
1984 brings us Swamp Thing number 20. This is the introduction of Alan Moore to the title, where he completely redefined what it meant to not just take on a character that's beloved, but also comic writing in general, and covering topics that really made you think about what it meant to be human. Like, comics are starting to get a little weird in a good way.
So although Alan Moore took over with issue 20, you need to read issue 21. That's called the anatomy lesson, where he goes deep, deep, deep and dives into the whole nature of Swamp Thing and completely reinvents and changes the character, which we will see Alan Moore definitely likes to do that moving forward. We're going to be talking about him throughout this entire video.
So as the landscape is changing with this outstanding writing, it's also changing with the amount of publishers that are out there. We see Gold Key Comics, who was a long-running publisher for decades, go under, and same with Charlton. But the exciting thing about Charlton is we don't lose them forever. DC Comics would buy the rights to their characters, so that's not the last we're gonna see Blue Beetle, Peacemaker, all these fantastic characters that we would know, which is gonna lead to possibly one of the greatest written works Watchmen by Alan Moore.
We're firmly in 1986 now, and it's fun to think about the emotional highs that comic readers must have been on with the events that were introduced in years past. And then to have Alan Moore create Watchmen and completely redefine the superhero genre in a short 12 issues.
This is a theme we're going to talk about throughout this whole video. You've probably already noticed. Deconstruction, spearheaded mostly by Alan Moore through Swamp Thing, and now we're seeing in Watchmen, but he really had a bug to kind of deconstruct superheroes and get at why people are fascinated by them. And he wanted to tell this story through the lens of the newly acquired Charlton characters that DC had just scooped up. But wisely, I think, the editors at DC didn't want him to tell this incredibly dark, gritty, fatal story featuring some of the characters they just paid money for, so he had to create new ones.
Imagine how this could have changed everything for characters that we love to this day. I mean, Peacemaker would have been the comedian. I mean, Captain Atom would have been Dr. Manhattan.
The Night Owl was inspired by Blue Beetle. Rorschach was inspired by The Question. This Watchmen book was the greatest piece of written material potentially in comic books ever, and it came out in 1986. A huge year for this type of material. We saw this with Frank Miller as well, a name we haven't mentioned yet, but an unbelievable artist and storyteller who evolves Batman into a whole nother realm and region in depth that we've never seen before.
Could you imagine being in 1986 and picking up Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns? Like, this is when the Batman becomes the Batman we all know. This is when we see Batman go up against Superman. This year marks this change for the entire industry because both of these creators would just start having hit after hit.
I think these are probably the two most important creators of this time period. You got Alan Moore and you got Frank Miller, and yeah, like we weren't alive at the time, at least I wasn't. 1986, this must have been crazy to be able to go to the shop and pick up Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns on the same day. It's incredible. Dark Knight Returns is like a post-apocalyptic Batman story with a dark, old future Batman who really has given up on being Batman, who is pulled back into the... It's dark. Especially after watching decades of Adam West campy Batman on TV, this was sorely needed. And actually, before this even, Frank Miller redefined Daredevil as well. Daredevil Born Again, which is now being used as the basis for the upcoming Disney Plus TV show. All of this stuff from this era of comics is really, really important for the current modern era of not just comics, but TV and movies as well.
1986 brings John Byrne to the pages of Superman with Man of Steel. They had to rewrite the origin of Superman for the modern age because post-Crisis, all these characters were getting a refresh, which speeds us off to 1987, Volume 2s of Wonder Woman by George Perez, Flash with a Wally West speedster that would be our speedster for 22 years.
Despite all the doom and gloom that's going on with DC, back in Marvel, we had ASM Annual number 21. Peter Parker has time to get married to his long-loved Mary Jane Watson, which, to be honest, was a great and fun issue to read when it came out. I remember when it came out, and we got to see two versions of this cover. One with Mary Jane getting married to Spider-Man, and one getting married to Peter Parker, which is kind of what the dichotomy is of that relationship in total anyway.
So things are looking up for old Spidey, right? Everything's going great. He's getting married, things are looking great, he's nice and happy, but Kraven shows up. In Kraven's Last Hunt, the same year, we get what could be the biggest, most epic Spider-Man storyline we've ever had. This is a very, very dark book that I'm honestly surprised Marvel put out, and you need to read it if you haven't.
Kraven's Last Hunt is not only one of the best Kraven stories, but it's touted as one of the best Spider-Man stories of all time because of how dark it gets, how moody it gets, and there's a Kraven movie coming out soon. Aaron Taylor Johnson's running around on all fours. Clearly, this arc left its marks.
I'm going to bring it back to DC because we have one of the most important comic books, again, of this entire era coming out in this same year, 1987. Frank Miller back at it again with Batman Year One. This is a 4-issue retelling of Batman's origin. This is, I would say, the most popular, best, most well-received origin story that Batman has ever had. And again, this is a must-read.
Oh, we're not done with 1987, because we're going to discuss one of the greatest anthropomorphic characters that we've ever seen. Samurai Yosagi Yojimbo, #1, hits the newsstands, who first appeared in 1984, same year as the TMNT. Stan Sakai, the artist, an amazing artist, and still to this day, still producing new material for this rabbit.
Comics are starting to not just get mature, violent, they're getting adult. We have creators like Tim Vigil releasing Faust during this time. Hyper-violent, something that you wouldn't want to just have out on your coffee table in case someone randomly picks it up. Good stuff. But that would lead us to 1988, to some of the most mature storytelling that we've ever seen. And it's kind of crazy to think that some of it was produced by the big two publishers, Marvel and DC.
The common theme I think we've noticed throughout this entire age so far has been the dark and gritty, violent nature of these stories, and that would definitely continue here in 1988. First thing we're going to talk about here, Batman The Killing Joke, written by Alan Moore with amazing art by Brian Bolland.
We go from the 1970s clown prince of crime to a more villainous version of the Joker in the Bronze Age to now a more sadistic version of the character where he tortures Commissioner Gordon in the pages of The Killing Joke and paralyzes his daughter, Batgirl, Barbara Gordon.
If you thought The Killing Joke was enough to say how sadistic the Joker is, it wasn't, because Jim Starlin took it a little bit further with Batman: A Death in the Family. Because we see Joker not only kill Jason Todd Robin's mom, but kill Jason Todd himself in this issue. And we can't blame just the Joker. There's a little Joker in all of us, apparently, because there was a number for you to call to decide whether Robin lived or died.
The horror was put in the hands of the fans to control. The readers literally voted on whether or not Jason Todd would live or die. It doesn't get much darker than that, because this would be the death of Robin.
It's still going to get dark. We got to go back and look at Marvel again. Remember Peter Parker, Spider-Man, Secret Wars, that whole event? In the 8th issue of Secret Wars, Spider-Man found a new costume on that alien planet and brought it back to Earth. Spider-Man's now running around in a black suit, and I'm sure nothing's gonna happen there, right?
The great Todd McFarlane would begin his run on Amazing Spider-Man in issue 298, introduce a new character to be featured in full in Amazing Spider-Man 300 with quite possibly one of the greatest anti-heroes of all time. 1988 marks the creation of Venom.
This whole time, we've been seeing the rise of independent publishers and how they are competing in the now crowded comic book marketplace with the big two, Marvel and DC, trying to figure out ways to adapt and push back the rise of all of these new independent titles. With DC, they started imprints in this time period in the late 80s. Stuff like Vertigo and Elseworlds started to crop up, with them experimenting with new ways of telling stories in these worlds. In Vertigo in particular, we got the introduction of John Constantine in Hellblazer #1. We got the first American comic by Neil Gaiman in Black Orchid #1, and that is another important creator we need to keep an eye on as well.
We have Grant Morrison on Animal Man breaking the fourth wall in comic books. And by 89, the creation of Elseworlds allowed DC to start providing an opportunity for creators to just do whatever they wanted with the characters. To hell with continuity. Let's see what happens when Batman goes up against Jack the Ripper. And that's what started off this one-shot style comic book storytelling, Batman: Gotham by Gaslight.
One of my personal favorite comic books came out in 1989 as well. What I wanted to mention before we move too far ahead, Batman: Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth by Grant Morrison. More importantly, with artwork by Dave McKean. This artwork in here is amazing. It is dark, expressive, and it's a very different art style from what we've seen in comic history from like the Silver Age and the Bronze Age. People like Neil Adams and Bernie Wrightson, who are more interested in doing clean, expressive, direct representations of what they were trying to draw. You get Dave McKean in Arkham Asylum, everything suddenly just gets insane on purpose.
It's great that you brought up Dave McKean because he teams up with Neil Gaiman that same year to create one of the best, not just comic stories, but stories of all time, Sandman #1. And he brought that same unique art style to the pages of these books, specifically on the covers, with a 3D shelf that was literally photographed accompanying the painting that made the final art. The sides of this cover are literal items that he photographed in his own home.
Following up on Sandman, I feel like I have to mention The Crow, written and created by James O'Barr, who dealt with a very tragic moment of his life with the loss of his fiancée, and then transcribed that in the pages of this book. And when you read this tale of a black and white story, you can feel the maturity that comics have grown to and the depths that they can really reach for you on an emotional level. And we get to see that actually in a film just several years later.
And then we have Batman '89, Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson, Tim Burton Batman, just shaking the foundation of the comic book marketplace, largely because it's starting to look so appealing, not just for independent creators who may get lucky and start a fresh IP worth over $1 billion out of their garage, but the big box offices are looking at this as a prime way to invest their marketing dollars.
When I think of the success of Batman '89, the logical next step for me is Batman the Animated Series, which would debut a few years later. And to me, that just crystallizes the importance of an entire IP around these characters. With Batman, for example, you've got comic books, you've got a successful live action movie, and a few years later, we will have a successful cartoon, which is the formula that has been applied all throughout this decade. In the 80s in particular, I think is when we saw the rise of the whole multimedia franchise empire.
Thundercats, Transformers, G.I. Joe, although spawning from the 80s would thrive throughout this period.
If you lived through the 80s, you lived through Saturday morning cartoons. That was it. That shaped you as a person, and that transcended from the TV to the comics to the toys. And as we keep mentioning IPs, that's exactly what this is. It is more than just an individual thing. It's the entire sphere of all of it together. And that is how an empire was built by Marvel and DC at that time.
Between 1990 and 1992, we begin to see the era start to transition. And we have some major players that are starting to hit their stride throughout this time and start having some giant wins. And then it goes nuclear. They become superstars, mainstream famous.
Two names that we need to mention to wrap up this year of 89 is Jim Lee, who just began doing pencils on X-Men 248, and later to have this unbelievable rise and become the head of DC, and then Rob Liefeld, who started off with New Mutants number 86.
Just 1 month later in New Mutants 87, 1990, Rob Liefeld would create and debut the first appearance of Cable. 1990 was a monster year. Todd McFarlane, after the success on Amazing Spider-Man, was granted his own run on title, and Spider-Man #1 would debut to 2.5 million copies sold. To say the landscape has changed would be an understatement at this point. The entire game has changed.
Now you may think that's an obnoxious number, but it's about to get crushed. And also we should touch on that they started to do these variations of the cover. So Spider-Man 1 came in multiple color versions of the same cover. Well, we're going to see Rob Liefeld dropping his own title because of all this massive success he's having with X-Force #1, where he had 5 million copies sell of the exact same book in a poly bag. Only difference, a different character card in the back.
When you do a trick like that and you put the same book in a bag with a different collectible trading card in the back of the bag, that really makes you want to buy multiples just in case. You want to collect them all, right? That's the mentality we're dealing with here. We've got one more book to look at, one more creator to look at, and that 5 million record copy sales that Jeff just mentioned for X-Force #1, forget that number. 8 million copies of this next book. X-Men #1, Jim Lee, Chris Claremont. This, to this day, is still the highest selling comic book of all time because there are multiple different covers. So again, the collectors are starting to come in and just change the way the market is handled.
You can't just make millions of copies sell and have that go unnoticed by the mainstream. We're starting to see television coverage. These creators are starting to become superstars in their own right, and they know it. And they want a bigger piece of the pie, but they know, based off of history, that that's not likely to happen unless they were to do something themselves. And they did. Collectively. They all quit. But that conversation is for another day. We appreciate you, the Variant Nation, as always.
Geek responsibly.
Enough said.
There you have it, my people, the amazing history of the Copper Age of comics. It really is one of the richest and most transformational eras in comic history. And thanks to our friends Comic Tom, Jeff the Golden Age Guru, and Fire Guy Ryan, you now see why. As promised, Tom is also giving away a first print Amazing Spider-Man 300, which is the first appearance of Venom in comic books. This is an insanely coveted book, and all you have to do to possibly be the one to take this beauty home is go to ComicTom101.com and subscribe to his newsletter using your email. When you get to the homepage, the newsletter sign-up option will come up on screen automatically. Just enter your email, hit subscribe, and you'll be entered to win the amazing Grail piece ASM 300, the first appearance of Venom. The winner will be drawn at the end of January, so put your name in the hat now so you don't miss out. We also want to send a huge thanks to Comic Tom, Jeff the Golden Age Guru, and Fire Guy Ryan for all the work they put into bringing this dope episode to the Variant Nation. These guys are the best, and if you're not already following them, links to all their content is in the description below. But that's a wrap for Variant 2023. Happy New Year, everybody, and we'll see you in 2024.